suite. And we design all of our forms inside of InfoPath. It's kind of the standard forms tool for SharePoint environments. Couple things to note about how ShareVis works with InfoPath is, first of all, you only need InfoPath to design the form. Now this is a significant departure from the way that SharePoint out of the box works. With SharePoint out of the box, you would need InfoPath not only to design the form, but then the users that are reviewing and adding and creating the forms, well, they would need InfoPath as well. Or there's a product that Microsoft has called the Microsoft Form Server that allows you to display the forms through a web browser. That is not the case with ShareVis. With ShareVis, we just use InfoPath to design the form, and then everybody else only needs a browser. They don't need an install of InfoPath, nor do you need Microsoft Form Server running on your server. So a significant difference. We've had customers that have had significant cost savings by not having to buy InfoPath client license or upgrade to Moss Enterprise, which is the only version of SharePoint that you can get the Form Server with. And so you might consider that. The other thing about the way that ShareVis uses InfoPath is ShareVis doesn't use just InfoPath. It has added some enhancements to InfoPath. So if you look on the right-hand side of my screen, here's the InfoPath toolbox. And you can see all these different enhancements that ShareVis has added. I think there's 19 of them that exist inside of InfoPath. So the point is, InfoPath is a very powerful tool, but there's a couple shortcomings of InfoPath. And ShareVis has taken InfoPath and enhanced it so that we can design our forms even faster. So even if you didn't need the workflow engine of ShareVis, you could probably still design forms faster using ShareVis-enabled InfoPath because it enhances InfoPath. I'll give you just a couple quick examples, and if you've used InfoPath, you'll be familiar with this. One of the examples is a control that is called the ShareVis form name control, right there. The ShareVis form name control allows you to use non-intelligent sequential numbering on your forms. So if you have a process and you just want to have a counter on the process, the ShareVis form names control does that for you. You may be surprised to know that you can't do that in InfoPath. In InfoPath, you would have to write code, JavaScript, or C# or VB.NET in order to do that. And that's a lot of work for something that's a pretty common task that we do inside a form. So ShareVis has added a control to do that. Another quick example is a ShareVis URL control. Now in InfoPath, you can put a URL on a form and it will render as a URL, and when you click on it, it'll open your browser to that URL. So that works fine. The problem is, what if you want that URL to pop up in a separate window? Well, you can't do that with InfoPath without doing programming. So ShareVis has created a control. If I drop that on my design palette, I can just check a box, and whenever I click on that URL, it'll open it into a new window. So it's those sort of things, and even things that are much more advanced than that ShareVis has done inside of InfoPath. So when you look at the InfoPath form, a couple things that you note about it is, of course, we can lay it out to look like however we want. This is an expense report. So we've got some information at the top about what number are we submitting, what's our name, our title, department, all of that sort of stuff. And then here in the middle of the form, we've got what we call a repeating table. And so this is going to be row after row after row of all of our individual expenses. And then down at the bottom, we've got some area where we can explain the expenses a little bit more. And those are repeating tables as well. So this is created, like I said, in InfoPath using just normal design tools. It's much like using Microsoft Office, Microsoft Word. You just type in there and you can drop some controls in if you need them. There's some properties you can set on the control. Of course, you can have things like date pickers. You can have drop-down lists. You can make some fields numeric, some fields text. You can make fields required. You can make fields hidden or visible and all kinds of things like that. Now, the second half of a ShareVis process is that workflow back end. And so I pulled up a tool called the ShareVis Designer, which is the tool that we use to create processes. And so a ShareVis Designer process is created inside of this tool. It's a flow chart that you draw. And you can see that each ShareVis process is expressed in the form of a swim lane diagram. So each of these colored bands represents a role within the workflow. And then each of the shapes represents an activity that that role is going to be involved in. And then we can go through, and we'll get into this a little bit as we go on, how do you assign the user to each activity and that sort of thing. But just real quick, you can kind of see what this process looks like. It starts off by the originator filling out his form, and then when he sends it on its way, it goes to his manager. We'll talk again about how that manager gets assigned and that sort of thing. If the manager approves it, well, then it goes down this path and goes into the accounting swim lane, and then eventually over here to the pay expenses, where accounting does an activity that causes the expenses to be paid. And then we send an email out to the originator that says, in fact, we can look at the body of that email if you want, the email will say your expense report number such and such submitted on this date in the amount of whatever was approved. And so we send him an email that tells him that that has happened. Now, if the manager chooses to reject it, it goes into what we call a revision loop. And that revision loop looks like this, where the originator can make revisions, the manager can then review those revisions, and he may or may not approve the revisions. He may send it back to the originator. This, again, is something that is significantly different than out-of-the-box SharePoint, the ability to get into these loops that can happen multiple times. So in SharePoint workflow, if you want to create a loop, you actually have to draw every time the loop may or may not occur. So if you want a loop that's going to occur up to 5 times, you have to draw 5 different occurrences of that. If you want a loop that could occur up to 10,000 times, you have to draw 10,000 occurrences. In this case, this loop is drawn only once, but it can occur as many times as it needs to occur. This loop will continue back and forth between these two people until the manager finally approves the expense report. And I only have to draw it once. So that is a true state machine workflow, which if you've used SharePoint Designer workflows, you recognize that you cannot do that. You cannot send something back in time in a SharePoint Designer workflow. So that's a significant difference, but it's actually a common part of a lot of workflows, the ability to send something back to someone who saw it previously and have them do some work to it. So that's what the workflow tool looks like and how we design our workflow. This particular process has already been published and it's all ready to run. So let's run through how a user might kick off one of these processes. There's a number of different ways to kick off a process. In this case, I've got a site called Accounting, and you notice I have a hyperlink right in there called Enter a New Expense Report. So a user could navigate to the accounting site, and he could click on the Enter a New Expense Report, and he could do it that way. Or maybe he has a shortcut on his desktop where he can kick off a new process. So there's another way you could do it. You could have a shortcut right on your desktop, double-click it, and it'll kick off a new process. A way that we find that a lot of people like to do it is right inside of Outlook. A lot of people kind of use Outlook as their portal, and that's where they spend the majority of their time. It's where their calendar is, their email, and their tasks for the day. So they spend a lot of time in Outlook. So you could actually kick off the process right inside of Outlook if you wanted to. So I can go through here and just say I want to kick off a new expense report. And so it has launched the browser inside of Outlook, and I can start to work on this new expense report right here inside of Outlook. So a couple things happen. First of all, let me get out of here because I need to log into the system as a different user. So I'm going to back out of here because I want to be in the system as a different user. So let me log in as Tom. And there we go. So now we're logged into the system as a different user. It just will affect the way my workflow works as we continue. So again, kick off that new expense report. And you'll notice a couple things that have happened with this new expense report. The first thing that you'll see is that it has assigned an automatic number for me. So again, I've got my system set up just to give me a non-intelligent sequential counter, and so it went ahead and did that for me. The other thing is, of course, it knows who I'm logged into the system as because it can take that information, then it pumps it into the form, and so it knows who I'm logged in as. Now notice it also knows my title, my department, and my location. Well, where did that information come from? Well, ShareVis has the ability to connect to Active Directory in order to get information about a particular individual. So that's where that came from, is I've got ShareVis configured to go to Active Directory, find out Tom's title, his department, and the office location that he's in, and that was all set up for me. So that connection to Active Directory can also be used then to decide who we should route this to. So in the case of our particular process, you'll notice we're going to send it to the manager swim lane. Well, who is the manager? Well, doesn't that depend on who's logged in? I mean, some people have different managers than other people. So we're actually going to dynamically assign the manager of the swim lane based on whoever is the current logged in user. So in this case, we can see that we're logged in as Tom, and we've got some information filled out. Now you'll notice there's some red asterisks up here. Those indicate that fields are required. So when we designed this form, we said that those fields were required, and so they show as red asterisk. In fact, if you try to send this thing on its way without filling in the requirements, you will get an error message that says the form cannot be submitted, and then it will highlight for me what requirements are missing. And so we can prevent people from submitting things that don't have the appropriate information. That a lot of times will kind of bog down our process because it goes to the next individual and he doesn't have the information he needs, and he's got to send it back. So in this way, we can try to prevent some of that if possible. So I'm going to say my expense report was for last week, so I'm filling out some information about the dates of the expense report. And then I've got this area of this repeating table where I can go in and start to put in some of my expenses. So we need to put in the specific date of each expense. And so in this case, we had some airfare. And again, the way that this form looks, that's up to you. You can, some of these columns, may not mean anything to you. I actually designed this form for one of our customers, and so I'm just using their example, and that's what some of this stuff means, the account segment and all these other things. I don't know what half of this stuff means, but you get the idea. You can create some pretty complex forms. Now, in this case, it's airfare, so that would be air and ground transportation, and that cost us $373. Now, when I tab out of that field, notice that the total over to the left, or I'm sorry, to the right is totaled. The total down below is totaled, and then there's a grand total over here in the corner. So we're using just Excel-like functionality where you can add cells together and get totals. And so ShareVis has the ability to do some math on the form for us. In this case, we've got another expense, which was our hotel. And we have a lodging expense of $85 for our hotel. And again, when we tab out of there, you'll notice that the lodging account shows an expense of $85 now. 85 appears over here, and now the grand total shows the total of those two expenses. And we can insert one more expense if we want, and we'll put in some copies. And we've got some office supplies then, and those were $37, and so we'll put those expenses in. And once again, all the totals line up for us. You can do some complex math in here as well, like, for example, the mileage. If I put in mileage expenses, you'll notice it's multiplying it by 0.275 and coming up with the total amount. So you can do things like that if you need to. Again, it's just simple math that we do that with. Now, in our case, we have to attach receipts if we have an expense that's greater than $25. And so ShareVis will enforce this and will make sure that a receipt is attached if there's an expense greater than $25. Again, this prevents it from getting further on in the process and having information missing. So I can go out there and browse for a particular receipt. Now, in this case, I have scanned in some receipts as PDF files. ShareVis doesn't care what kind of files they are. If you want to scan them in, we had one customer that got a download from AmericanExpress.com, and the download was like an Excel file, and so they use that. It doesn't really matter. It's just a file at this point. ShareVis doesn't care. It will take and attach the expense for us, so we can go through and attach these couple receipts. If we needed to delete one or take one off, maybe we attached the wrong one, we could go through and do all that for us. Down at the bottom is just an area to add some additional information that doesn't really apply to what we're doing here. And then lastly, you'll notice we've got a statement here that says, by submitting this expense, you verify such and such. And then if I click on that button, that verifies that, and we'll kick off the expense report and send it on its way. So again, we're logged in now as Tom Quality. So according to the process here, this should look at Active Directory, figure out who my manager is, and then send it to my manager. So we'll go ahead and hit the button to kick this thing off and send it on its way. So what will happen is the process is now kicked off. There it is. You can see it's got this icon that shows it's kind of in process mode. The ones below it are approved. That's why they have the green check mark. And so now we can sit there and wait for the assignment to come in. Now, most people will get their assignments via email. That's generally, again, the way people like to operate is they like to see things come in through email. So if I sit in my email, you'll notice that a new assignment has been given to Patty Manager. And Patty Manager, according to Active Directory, is my manager. So that's why we see that that assignment went to Patty Manager. Now, there's a couple things that are interesting about the way this works. Notice that Patty's email, it's got a subject line. It has her assignment. Down at the bottom, there's some history about what has taken place already. And then notice also Patty has two hyperlinks that say click here to approve or click here to reject your assignment. It may be that Patty is the type of person who isn't frequently in the office. Maybe she travels a lot, and she gets her email through her BlackBerry or through her iPhone or something like that. Well,